Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and today I'm thrilled to be talking to Dichen Lachman all about Severance. And one of the things I was so interested about in terms of how you developed your character in season one was that ultimately Miss Casey is developed off the foundation of who Gemma is, but you didn't really have many details. I know you had all of the scripts for the whole of season one up front, but it's really just these little inferences of how other people described her. And so I was really interested in how helpful it was to dive into the depths of who Gemma was to build Miss Casey, or if it was more helpful to focus primarily on just who Miss Casey was.
Yeah, absolutely. You're so right. And it is sort of nerve-wracking to go through that process because first, when you're shooting first season of television, you never know if you're gonna get to, do the second season. And then obviously they're not thinking about that as much, when they're in the midst of shooting the first. So I did exactly what you said. I grabbed little pieces of what other people spoke about. I had a vague roadmap in my mind in terms of how I imagined who she was. And then I grabbed on to that moment when he's building the tree out of clay in the wellness center. And that for me was like a little clue as to this is deep, deep subconscious in these innies of their exterior characters. And they're never going to understand those feelings. But I chose to make it about my connection to Mark S. And I didn't know why, but Miss Casey had just this desire to want to belong and be close and around him, but not know why. And obviously the others on the severed floor have each other and they have this great dynamic. And she's essentially just, in these little worlds and then pulled out of them. But for some reason, the most time she ever had was the 8 hours she spent with them. And it was because of him. That's how I painted it in my mind.
It also feels like you were so specific in terms of just the tone of her voice and what's that going to sound like, and kind of being less emotional with the way that she speaks and just the physicality. And I was interested in how you found those aspects.
I think because in her life, she was a professor and she's very intelligent. In terms of Miss Casey, I thought maybe that little thread of just being very precise about how she does things, so she's given a task and she knows exactly what she needs to do to execute it and holding on to that thread. It's almost like when you inherit something from, a grandparent or maybe an aunt, like it jumps a generation. Each innie sort of had little inherited like aspects of Gemma, and not the whole, obviously, but just small aspects of her. And it is a very fragmented character that I think Jessica and everybody did such a beautiful job in Seven. It all sort of comes together.
Yeah, and in episode seven of this season, I know that you got to film the entire rest of the season first before filming that. And obviously, you and Adam have such incredible and such emotional scenes together in the finale. How much did that help you when it then came to building out their backstory and all of those flashbacks?
It was an enormous help because we actually got to spend a lot more time together. And as an artist, when you get to know your co-stars and your collaborators about just even their personal life, it creates a rapport that it's not always, but sometimes difficult to manufacture without that relationship. Sometimes you need that distance because of the role that you're playing. But in this case, I found it enormously helpful. And he's such a warm human being. He's an incredible actor, but that warmth and that welcome energy really helped, I think, really ground us in Seven.
And when you were rehearsing those scenes, it sounds like some of the details kind of really evolved, or you would find certain aspects along the way. And I was curious about what were some of the details that really came into play in the flashbacks from the rehearsal process.
We were so fortunate to be able to rehearse, even though, everyone was so, overwhelmed with just the amount of work there was. It was incredible that because everyone cares so much, they carved out the time to rehearse, which often we did. But in this case, we got to be in the house, in the space, because Jessica, you may or may not know this, but it was her house that she was living in for season one and season two. And it just happened that everyone felt like it was perfect for Mark and Gemma's home. So we were able to just go there on a weekend and go through the scenes. And what came out of it essentially was obviously there's moments there that are really difficult. And, most people in a relationship might, relate to obviously the ups and downs of it. But I think it helped make some of those moments a little bit more playful. And we got to sort of infuse our energy into it more. And then because that got to marinate in us, I think it found that perfect balance of a normal relationship where people fight, they're happy, they're sad, and it's a roller coaster.
I imagine it must have felt like there was a certain amount of pressure as well, because, essentially in watching the show, the audience knows this is a relationship where the grief has taken him so hard that he chose to get severed because he couldn't cope with it anymore. And so you're having to build the foundation of what that looked like. And, it's such a challenge to arc out the very first moment they met to the very last time they see each other, because it's over such a huge period of time and there's so many different things that we learn that they went through. How did you set about figuring out what that growth and what those slight changes were going to be over time for her?
I suppose the fact that we had episode 7 before the strike. We had two big strikes, right smack bang in the middle of season 2. And even though that was an extraordinary difficult time for everybody, one of the silver linings of it was I was able to sit with this script for months and months. And I understood, and as I always do, that changes would be made and things would move around, as is with, most television when you have a script. Um, but because there was no communication during that time, it was a really great opportunity to sit and marinate in that world. Marinate's such a weird word to use. I'm sorry, I just couldn't think of a better one. But to map it out in my mind, to create that journey.
And it's also really lovely getting to see these moments of lightness between them, because obviously everything in Lumen is so tense the whole time and feels so suffocating as a bubble. And just, seeing Mark and Gemma in a moment where they're going through really difficult times, and they're in the bathroom and they're doing the IVF shots, and he's like, turn around and bend over, and they're just laughing with each other, even though they're also really emotional and it's difficult. And what was that like for you to kind of really get to look at the lightness and the levity between them?
Yeah, I think that just to go back to your last question, that scene was one of the scenes that really benefited from the rehearsal, because initially it was a little heavier. And as we went through the process, I think it was important for all of us to be like, of course this is like a heavy subject, and we want to do it justice, but we also have to find the life in it, and the weirdness of it. And that scene initially, I hope I'm speaking correctly, but I remember it being quite heavy. And during that rehearsal process, we had like a big discussion, and it just totally changed. It's why it was so valuable, because it's hard to do that on a show like this at the last minute, where there's so much scrutiny goes into like every single detail, and amazingly the fans pick it up, which is just so rewarding. But it's difficult to change things at the last minute. So um, finding those little moments to pepper into a really gut-wrenching episode, I think was really important.
And it was so beautiful as well to see the friendship between Gemma and between Devon and just that completely silent communication about her being pregnant at the dinner table without the guys even knowing that they're talking about that.
Yeah, it
Um,
was so brief, but was so important. And I've got to say, I just absolutely love working with Michael and Jen. I mean, that scene around the table, I was really looking forward to that because what they did in season one in terms of building their relationship with Gemma to an audience who, didn't know her was so important. And it really informed me of the warmth and the relationship that they had, which helped me build the character.
And one of the scenes that's obviously really, really emotionally heavy is the moment where Devon's in the bathroom and she's having the miscarriage, and we see the blood on her leg, and it's just her there for a moment, and so you have her processing it by herself and just climbing into the shower, and then you have the moment where Mark's there for her, and then that changes the energy of the scene a little bit. And I was just interested in kind of how you found the depth of that scene and just the importance of it, because it says so much about them in that moment where, again, they don't need to exchange words, but they have that whole communication in the shower together.
Yes, and then there's that incredible shot of him that goes into uh, MDR. It was beautiful. Yeah, that was quite intense, and I worked a lot with my breath, and it was it was one of those like really quiet scenes where we really had to like feel the gravity of that moment. A funny anecdote, which it's weird to tell a funny anecdote about a heavy scene, is there was a lot of trying on different sort of like sized like bumps, like a small baby bump. And it wasn't really quite working because the fabric of the costume was so fine. And I told Sarah, the costume designer, I was like, I bloat really easily. So if I just eat like an orange and some carbs, we'll be fine. So I actually felt like that because when I was pregnant with my daughter, for those early stages, I really did just feel very bloated. Sorry if that's too much information, but doing that for the scene actually physically helped me have that, that feeling and preparing for it physically, I think was really important because as a woman, you would know, like we go through many seasons, very frequently, and your body can feel so different. It's like a roller coaster ride, every, 10 days or whatever. And I use my body a lot to inform how I feel, my breath. So I know that's a silly thing, but physically, just having that weight there and that discomfort was very helpful.
And then there's also that moment when they're sitting in the doctor's office together in the waiting room. And it's really lovely that that's a moment that they say, I love you to each other. But then when Gemma says, I'm sorry, you just get that impending sense of logically, she knows it's not her fault that they lost a baby, but there's just that emotional kind of gut-wrenching feeling that she has. And so I wanted to ask you about how, it really is something that just completely carries through all the rest of the scenes for her.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I should just speak for myself, but I often find myself apologizing for things that aren't my fault. Maybe you can
Same.
relate to that. Um, and I must stop, but because it's, one of the things that I need to work on, but it is such a feeling that from the people that I've spoken to, but also, in my life experience, things like that, even though they're out of your control, like as a woman, you feel like there's something wrong with you, or, just going back to like being a woman is so difficult, and it's very difficult for men to understand how hard it is to lose a baby, or even when you do finally get that, are blessed with a pregnancy, that you want to see through, that's another roller coaster ride in and of itself. And then, once so not to go on about it, but it's like, it's a very difficult thing for someone who doesn't actually physically have to go through that to understand. And yet, well, at least I do, and the women that I've spoken to, they still feel the burden of it, like it's something that they can control, which we absolutely can't. It's very, very difficult to control it. And whenever you intervene with something, medical or whatever, that messes other things up. And so we're constantly riding these waves. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but it was just important to me to emphasize that fact that we don't have a lot of control, and yet and we apologize for it. Well, at least I feel like I do, and people I know do.
No, you're so right with all of that, and it's such a great point as well. And it's interesting as well because then when we look at the other side of all of the scenes that you're playing in that episode, we're ultimately seeing these flashbacks through through Gemma's memories while she's sitting in Lumen. And so then you have that side of the performance of sitting there and just the emotional weight of remembering these moments and the fact that she's always connecting back to her history with Mark. And I was interested in how much context you had as you were filming each of those moments of what the memory associated might be, if it was kind of on the page or if it was more just the general emotion and it very much came together with the specific beats in post-production for the team.
Oh, the transitions
Yeah.
from, yeah, that was very, very specific, because a lot of those transitions were technically incredibly hard to achieve. And the shot where they go down with like all the cables, into the floor, and then, into the watcher's room, that was all practical. And Scott, one of our camera operators, spent months on that, building that shot with Jess. Like, they were collaborating on, like, let's do it practically. So all of those transitions were like very purposeful, and I'm pretty sure they were all scripted. Like, so everything led on to the next thing. So when the script changed, it didn't change structurally very much, like after the first few, I mean, maybe like there were moments and things, but those were things I had to really plan for and build for quite some time.
And you're also tasked with building so many different severed innies of Gemma throughout that episode, and they all feel connected, and yet there are these slight differences in how she feels walking into each of these rooms and each of these personas. And going back to what you were talking before about how you love to kind of really use the physical side and use your body and think about your breath, how did you use those aspects to find these little changes that felt ever so slightly different but still always connected?
Yes, absolutely. Her posture, where her fear was sort of manifesting, was like a big thing. It's so awful to think about a being, in any of those situations, and that's all they ultimately know. It's a very strange sort of torture and abuse. So the costumes and the hair and the makeup, I think, you walk into that and it does change you, that just physically you feel different. But then also just what she feels like when she walks into the room. In the airplane, you don't really see her transition. I mean, you see her transition, but it's very quick into the airplane. But in the dentist scene, I just used my posture and my tension to really, feel absolutely terrified. And they're quite naive, they're all sort of, because there's no one else to interact with except for the doctor. There's a very strange power structure and dynamic that I used. And Robbie, who is the nicest person in the world, is just so wonderful to work with.
One of the tiny details that I loved in one of the rooms was when she's writing all of the thank you notes and it being something that she hates, and you just see that huge stack, and the fact that you're ultimately holding the fountain pen kind of upside down and the handwriting is just completely squiggled. And so I wanted to ask about that detail coming together and just the decisions of that.
Yeah, that was really tricky. Sometimes a lot of those things are done like on an insert. So you're trying to technically get it exactly right for the camera. And one of the things that was really difficult was like to have the tension in the hand and to get the writing, like to just show that she had been doing this for hours and hours. So I chose to write with my left hand, which I'm right-handed. And that made it a lot easier to create that feeling. And it's sort of, a lot of what we do is like those little things. They're little, like, I guess I don't want to call it a trick, but it's just like, well, here's the solution to getting what we need to communicate across. And I actually think someone did notice that I was writing with my left hand. And I was like, a fan, I came across it and I was like, oh no.
You can't get anything past Severance
Can't get
fans.
anything by anybody. It was just really because hard to like have this tension and write messy and do it all. I mean, often I mean, I do it with stunts and stuff all the time, but it was so specific, So yeah, I went with the left hand, and some very perceptive fan picked it up.
You were also talking before about there being these essences of things that feel familiar, but the characters don't necessarily know why it feels subconsciously familiar. And I remember you talking about how that was how you went into the room where she's building the crib when she's in Cold Harbor. And I was just curious if that was something just straight out of the gate. You would just, it has to feel familiar, but she has to not understand why. So there's going to be this confusion as well as this undercurrent of emotion that she can't quite put a finger on.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of went in there. It's like, I think she knows what it is, and it feels familiar, but she doesn't know why. And she just has to do what she's told. And it was a scene that we spent a lot of time on. We obviously had to get lots of different coverage because you have the security footage and then you're shooting it practically. And that was one I really needed to ask Dan about, like where and Ben, where do you want her to sit? And they guided me through that because obviously as an actor, you know what it is, but your character it's just like a fragment, it's something in the deep recesses of her mind in our story. So even though for me, knowing the story, it was like quite an emotional thing, I had to sort of shut that part down and do what Mara was telling me over the speaker.
And when Mark comes into the room in Cold Harbor and he's covered in blood and she doesn't know who he is, but she trusts him enough to follow him and go with him, did you feel like there was a huge part of it because he comes in and he has this really gentle energy with her, and that's not something that she's been experiencing in these testing rooms, and the language that he's using is completely normal speak, and we've seen her in the testing room say, can you please just speak normally? And did you feel like, as much as the subconscious probably connected, that even just those things probably played a huge part in why she decides to go with him?
Oh, yeah. I mean, definitely exactly what you said. There was that sort of familiarity in the back of her mind, just like Miss Casey has, or he had when he made the tree out of the clay. But at the same time, he's covered in blood. I mean, I assumed that, like, even if she didn't understand how someone would get into that situation, it's just a very scary sight. But I mean, Adam was so beautiful in that scene. And you're so right. Like he came across like very much like he was there to help this complete, like for her, it is essentially a complete stranger, but she feels like she can trust him. It's just her instincts, that she cannot explain.
And when they're in the elevator together with Mark and they switch floors and the severance kicks in, and all of a sudden it's Gemma and it's Mark together for the first time. And it's such a beautiful moment. I've heard you mention that actually you found the emotional side a little bit easier than just the physical side of that transition because you and Adam had to time that alignment of when it happens, like to the millisecond of it happening in exactly the same second with each other. And again, it's such a physical difference between Gemma and Miss Casey to switch into in an instant.
Very difficult transitions in episode 10. Um, it's not just like, oh, you're one person and now you're someone else. To go from no real like emotion to, oh my God, Mark, I've been waiting for you. I've been trying to escape this place and you've come to save me. To, Gemma's timeline in 10 is very strange. She goes into Cold Harbor. She comes out and there's Mark, and that is such an incredible moment. They're running there in the elevator, and then she's outside and he's walking away from her. So it was it was really challenging because as an actor, usually in like the real world, you get like a ramp into a scene, so you can build that emotion, whether it's joy or sadness. There's a natural progression, and that doesn't happen in our world at all. So technically, it was challenging to physically build that because it did become very, very technical.
And I know in talking about that final sequence that, you kind of had this feeling of she puts everything together fairly quickly, and it is just this gut instinct of realizing, oh, that's his innie and he doesn't know who I am in the same way. And that's why he's turning around and walking towards Helly. Was there a particular beat or a particular moment in that scene where you felt like this is the moment that she's put it together and she's realizing?
Yes, but I was blurry in the background. I think it's for me, like when I map it out in my head, it's that moment when she sees Helly and then Helly looks at her and then it's on him and Gemma's in the background, sort of, in soft focus. I think she realizes in that moment very quickly, oh my gosh, like he must be severed as well. And then she's just really going for it to see if she can reach into like the depths of his subconscious to get him to come back out, so I think like half of her at the on that side of the door is like, well, what are you doing, like, come on, we gotta go, and then as he's walking away, it's like, what are you doing, like she's almost angry at her husband for walking away, but the minute she sees her, I think it just clicks, um and maybe that's not how they planned it, but in my mind I feel like that has to make the most sense. I mean, she's an intelligent person, she understands this world, she understands what happens to the mind when you're severed. She's been down there for long enough, so I think it's the only logical conclusion because of the way they reunited, and her very short memory of seeing him on the other side of that door, to running to the elevator, to being in the elevator. It's the only logical thing.
Was there a lot of consciousness and kind of having to be really specific with always mapping the idea of memory? Because, like you said, in those moments, you have such a clear picture of, okay, this is where Gemma was, this is what's happened now, and this is what happens now, because you need to make sure that nothing is kind of coming through from any of the scenes in between. And yet you're playing so many different character versions of the same character.
Yeah, there was a lot of map. And sometimes we'd forget. I remember when we were shooting the scene with Sandra Bernhardt when she, falls into a pile on the elevator floor. We were shooting this running away into the elevator and going up, and then she transitions into Miss Casey and then coming back down we were sort of shooting all of it at once, like running into the elevator. She goes up, she transitions, and then she transitions out, and then she, has this like just this feeling of complete hopelessness. And then after like 3 takes, I was like, Jessica, wait, we have to, there's a whole scene with Milchick. So we have to kind of find, we have to find that beat there. And we were like, oh my gosh, yes, of course. And then we split it up. But initially I was like, oh my gosh, I'm going through all these like different characters and we're shooting it in like this oneer. And we can make this a lot easier. But also, I think that it was helpful to do that initially. But yes, like mapping it's always important as an actor to sort of map where you are emotionally. But especially on a show where people are so perceptive, it becomes even more important.
And what's incredible is stepping back and looking back at all of your scenes throughout this season and just the number of nuanced, minute shifts and changes that you had to make, and the number of different emotional spaces that you had to carry your character and characters into. And obviously, I know you've been working in the industry and you've done so many projects and roles over the last 20 plus years. Did you find that in particular, working on the episodes of season 2 for Severance really was just accumulation of like bringing everything that you've ever experienced and everything you've done into this moment?
Yeah, it's like the resilience of that I've built over the course of my career, just in terms of having stamina, I think really helped. Because I mean, every morning was very, very early, energy drink waiting for me to like get through that day. I think having played so many different characters in my career definitely helped me draw more definite lines in terms of, like we talked about, the physicality and the breath and everything. And I'm really grateful for all the different characters I've been able to play up until now. But I think ultimately it was what helped was I could handle the pressure, which if I had been given this role 10 years ago, or you know maybe even, well, we've been doing this for 5 years, so let's say 10 years ago or more. I don't know if I would have coped with just the challenge of it as much, because it is really like doing gymnastics on this show, especially in that episode for her. So it was an immense amount of pressure because people scrutinize the fans. They love the show so much, and you don't want to make a mistake, you don't want to let them down, but also like to work with people that you've been dreaming about working with for over a decade, more 2 decades, and then to be in that environment. You really want to make sure that your work and your commitment is it's all there, and that you're giving 100,000%, because it's like a dream come true to work with these incredibly talented people.
I love that. And your performance in, especially this in the show in general is amazing and incredible in this season. And I'm so in awe of what you accomplished. So, congratulations. Thank you so much, Deechin.
Thank you.